All right, I want you to picture this for a second. You are an early human standing out on these vast open plains, and you are feeling incredibly small. Utterly terrified, honestly. Out of nowhere, a massive flood wipes out your entire settlement, or a violent earthquake just shakes the very ground you're standing on. These awe-inspiring, entirely frightening forces of nature were just completely beyond your control. But then, according to theologians, something absolutely incredible happened. This visceral fear, this really deep sense of the mysterious and the sacred, sparked a sort of light bulb moment. It was the very first God consciousness in the human mind. Basically, out of that sheer terror, this profound urge was born to find some permanent, universal principle in the middle of a chaotic, terrifying world. So in this explainer, we are diving into the evolution of belief, humanity's quest for the divine. We're going to trace the totally fascinating, chronological journey of how human beings have tried to make sense of the universe through theology. We'll look at how those frantic early attempts to appease nature evolved into these incredibly complex philosophical stages, ultimately shaping the major belief systems and disbelief systems that we see around us today. To really get this journey, we've got to start with the foundation that most of us are familiar with: theism. It comes from the Greek word theos, which means God, and it's simply the belief that one or more deities exist. This is the core of most major religions today, from Christianity and Judaism to Islam, Hinduism, and Sikhism. At its heart, theism affirms a divine reality, usually a personal, self-conscious deity that aligns individual life with a universal principle. But as you'll see in a minute, how we actually define that deity has varied wildly throughout human history. Part 1. Worshipping the Many, the Polytheistic Era. So, polytheism. The term poly literally means many. Early humans assigned different gods to very specific facets of nature. So you had gods of rivers, fertility, the sun, health, vegetation. And honestly, it makes perfect sense when you think about it. It was kind of like a cosmic corporate ladder. If you wanted a good harvest, you didn't bother the river god, right? You went straight to the vegetation gods department. We see this super relatable division of labor extensively in the Vedic lore of India and the ancient doctrines of Egypt, Rome, and Greece.
Now, what is super fascinating to me about polytheism is how it handled early globalization. It was surprisingly chill. A huge feature of polytheistic systems was their incredible religious freedom and tolerance. When these cultures met outside gods, they didn't usually declare holy war. Instead, they just assimilated them. They'd be like, oh, that's just our sun god under a different name. Or they'd happily adopt the new god into their own growing pantheon, or just accept that they exist without actively worshiping them. It was a remarkably inclusive worldview.
But, polytheism eventually hit a massive philosophical roadblock, and it becomes glaringly obvious when we contrast it with our modern scientific order. Think about it. If truly independent gods controlled every different aspect of reality, and they're often working at cross purposes or getting angry with each other, well, a unified set of natural laws just couldn't exist. The laws of physics wouldn't consistently apply to chemistry. True scientific order would find absolutely zero basis in a universe that's governed by a bunch of squabbling deities. So think of this next phase as the missing link in the evolution of religion. The theorist Max Muller actually viewed polytheism as an embryonic stage, because the ultimate goal of religion is often to find unity and diversity. That frantic competition among the gods had to evolve. This brings us to a really crucial stepping stone called henotheism. Muller famously described henotheism as monotheism in principle and polytheism in fact. It beautifully bridges the gap between the two.
Let's break down henotheism a bit more, because there are some incredibly subtle distinctions here. On one side, we have kathenotheism, which basically means worshiping gods one by one. You might pray to the rain god only during a drought, and then switch to the sun god during harvest, so each is supreme when you need them. But on the flip side, we have monolatry, which goes a step further. This is consistently worshiping only one god while completely ignoring the rest, even though you still admit they exist. It's literally the difference between calling a plumber only when your pipes burst versus swearing absolute lifelong loyalty to one specific plumber and ignoring all the others. It shows human devotion evolving from circumstantial need to exclusive loyalty.
Which leads us to part 2, the shift to one God, consolidating the divine.
Now, before we get to pure monotheism, we actually have to talk about ditheism. This doctrine attempted to answer a massive philosophical problem, the existence of evil. Ditheism assumes two opposed principles govern the universe. Think of the Parsi religion, with Ahura Mazda for goodness and Ahriman for evil. However, it ultimately failed to provide a really harmonious explanation of reality, because if good and evil are totally independent, how do they even interact with each other? You'd basically need a referee, a third higher power, just to manage the fight.
And that brings us right to monotheism, the belief in a single, all-powerful, all-knowing and self-sufficient God. Now here is a wild fact. It was actually the famous psychologist Sigmund Freud who theorized that monotheism might have originated in Egypt. He pointed to King Akhenaten, who established the worship of the sun god Aten as the sole religion way back in 1375 BCE by royal decree. Freud suggested this massive paradigm shift might have later influenced Moses in carving out the concept of one god for Judaism. But here's the thing, monotheism isn't just one monolithic idea. There are basically two distinct frameworks going on here. Inclusive monotheism, which you see in Hindu denominations like Smartism, says there is only one deity and all other claimed gods are just different names or incarnations of that one supreme god. Then there's exclusive monotheism, typical of most Abrahamic religions, which firmly asserts that only one deity exists and all others are utterly false. That's a huge historical pivot because this exclusive stance historically led to a lot less religious tolerance than we saw back in the polytheistic era.
Moving right along, Part 3, God and the Universe, Immanence versus Transcendence.
Okay, so once you've got a single supreme God, you have to answer a huge question. How does this God actually interact with our physical universe? Back in the 18th century, rationalists championed deism. They proposed the watchmaker God. In this view, God is purely transcendent. He created the finely tuned machine of the universe, set the natural laws in motion, and then just stepped back completely. Deism relies totally on human reason and natural laws. It absolutely rejects miracles, divine interventions, or supernatural revelations. The universe just runs on its own logic.
But wait, right? That raises a completely devastating question about deism. If God is entirely indifferent to the world he created, if he leaves it completely alone to just function independently, why create it in the first place? Thinkers argue this view is psychologically false and just spiritually inadequate. A completely absent God fails to satisfy that deeply rooted human craving for an intimate, personal connection with the divine.
So, human thought being what it is, it swung all the way in the exact opposite direction of pantheism. You see this in the works of philosophers like Spinoza and Hegel. Here, God and the universe are the exact same thing. God doesn't transcend nature, God literally is nature. He's fully immanent. But pantheism kind of loses the whole idea of individual human freedom. So, we find this fascinating middle course, panentheism. It steers perfectly between the two extremes. It posits that God interpenetrates every part of nature, but retains an independent identity that is greater than the material universe.
Charles Hartshorne had this absolutely brilliant way of explaining panentheism using a cell analogy. Think about your own body for a second. You are a collection of individual semi-autonomous cells, but your consciousness is something more than just a pile of biological matter. In panentheism, the universe is God's body. We are like the cells. We have our own relative freedom, just like the cells in our body operate independently of our conscious mind, yet we are enveloped within a much larger divine consciousness. It's a really cool way to balance human freedom with divine structure.
Which brings us to Part 4, Doubting the Divine, Atheism and Agnosticism.
So as we look at more modern challenges to religion, this vast philosophical quest leads a lot of people to doubt or totally deny the divine. Atheism draws heavily on modern scientific development and materialistic ideas. It basically argues that all those historical religious beliefs we just tracked, they have no actual basis in reality. According to materialistic philosophers, our knowledge and experience of the world contain nothing but material objects. Therefore, they say, questions regarding the universe should be answered purely through scientific knowledge, not theology. Now, on the flip side, theist thinkers definitely push back on this purely materialistic view. They point out that simply denying God doesn't necessarily answer the lingering questions of our origins. It completely fails to explain the ultimate creator or sustainer of the universe. Furthermore, despite massive scientific progress over the centuries, that innate human feeling of a supreme being hasn't been erased. Theists argue that atheism remains an incomplete theory because it just totally ignores the profound, deeply held personal religious experiences of literally billions of people.
And sitting right smack in the middle between absolute belief and absolute denial is agnosticism. This is a term coined by T.H. Huxley, and it literally translates to not-knowism. It is a position of suspended belief. Agnostics assert that we simply do not have sufficient reason or evidence to either boldly affirm or definitively deny the existence of God. The existence of a deity is considered inherently unknowable.
Skeptical philosophers like David Hume detailed this as the agnostic limit. It highlights the ultimate limitation of our own minds, which actually connects right back to those terrified early humans we started with. Because we can only empirically consider objects that exist within space and time, human reason totally fails to bridge the gap between empirical science and metaphysical reality. We simply lack the cognitive tools to prove or disprove a realm beyond our own material universe. And that brings us to the end of our explainer, leaving us with a really provocative question straight from the source material. After tracing this unbelievable journey, from fearing the storm to polytheism, through the fierce debates of monotheism, the cold logic of deism, the cellular connection of panentheism, all the way to modern atheism, the debate isn't just about whether God exists. It's about what we're even talking about when we say the word God. I invite you to reflect on where your own thoughts sit within this incredible evolutionary journey of human understanding. Thanks for joining me on this explainer.